My father's business was MS Farnbacher. It was a metal fabric company, and my mother's father was a part owner of the Bayerischen Rundfunks, which was actually taken over by the Nazis very early. It was taken over in 1933, so that my grandfather already left for Sweden in 1933. But my father's, they were old, established businesses. I don't know what kind of metal, but it's interesting. Last year when I was here and we went by the house, which is at 129 Königstrasse, behind the building they still are doing stuff with metal. We went back there where the warehouse was. It's an interesting question. I think that my parents were from fairly assimilated families. They were not at all pious Jews, but they were very Jewish in certain things. My father certainly had a bar mitzvah. I don't think would have ever thought of marrying somebody who wasn't Jewish, but they didn't do a lot of traditional Jewish religious things. I think, in fact, my parents became more religious and more Jewish as a result of the Holocaust, and certainly more committed to Zionism. Absolutely. Very Jewish identity. I have a lot of stuff, of menorahs and a lot of things that they were able to get out of Germany. All of it very Jewish. Mother graduated from, I guess, a gymnasium or whatever the equivalent was for girls at the time. She very much wanted to go to university. My grandparents were very opposed to it. They did not think that was befitting of a Jewish girl from a upper class family. Her name at that time was Lily, L-I Bechman, and they insisted that she go to finishing school in Geneva first. And if after finishing school she still insisted on going to the university, then they would allow her to go. So she went to finishing school in Geneva first, and then came back to Germany and started her studies at Freiburg, at the University of Freiburg. And my recollection of the story was that she had really almost completed her dissertation when Freiburg would no longer give degrees to Jews. It must have been around 1933, as soon as the Nuremberg laws came in, because she then transferred to Erlangen, and she got her PhD in 1934. My parents were married in 1933 as well, and I know that what was very important to my mother in getting married to my father was that he still allow her to complete her PhD. So she did get it in 1934, and I have all those documents at home, actually. And my mother's father was a part owner of the Bayerischen Rundfunks, which was actually taken over by the Nazis very early. It was taken over in 1933, so that my grandfather already left for Sweden in 1933. But my father's, they were old, established businesses. Very traditional food. Exactly. Yeah. No, I don't know what kind of metal, but it's interesting. Last year when I was here and we went by the house, which is at 129 Königstrasse, behind the building they still are doing stuff with metal. We went back there where the warehouse was.
Do you know anything about the which
It's an interesting question. I think that my parents were from fairly assimilated families. They were not at all pious Jews, but they were very Jewish in certain things. My father certainly had a bar mitzvah. I don't think would have ever thought of marrying somebody who wasn't Jewish, but they didn't do a lot of traditional Jewish religious things. I think, in fact, my parents became more religious and more Jewish as a result of the Holocaust, and certainly more committed to Zionism.
So you would say that your family had a Jewish identity?
Absolutely. Very Jewish identity. I have a lot of stuff, of menorahs and a lot of things that they were able to get out of Germany. All of it very Jewish.
We've learned that your mother studied different things
Yes.
in Germany, and that she even went to be.
Yes.
What do you know about the academic life?
Mother graduated from, I guess, a gymnasium or whatever the equivalent was for girls at the time. She very much wanted to go to university. My grandparents were very opposed to it. They did not think that was befitting of a Jewish girl from a upper class family.
Could you please give us your mother's name as well?
Yeah, her name at that time was Lily, Lilli Bechman. And they insisted that she go to finishing school in Geneva first. And if after finishing school she still insisted on going to the university, then they would allow her to go. So she went to finishing school in Geneva first, and then came back to Germany and started her studies at Freiburg, at the University of Freiburg. And my recollection of the story was that she had really almost completed her dissertation when Freiburg would no longer give degrees to Jews. And she, it must have been around 1933, as soon as the Nuremberg laws came in, because she then transferred to Erlangen, and she got her PhD in 1934. My parents were married in 1933 as well, and I know that what was very important to my mother in getting married to my father was that he still allow her to complete her PhD. So she did get it in 1934, and I have all those documents at home, actually. I've never been able to read her PhD because I don't read German that well. I thought that Mother got her degree in history of the theater, and that angle of history. I think had she stayed in this country, in Germany, she probably would have become a professional woman long before her time. When my parents got to the United States, life was not easy for them, and they had learned language, they had to get new skills. It was during the war. My father's business here was steel business. He could not get into the metal business in the United States because he was considered a German there, and America was at war with Germany, so they wouldn't give him any work. So Mother started working during the war. She taught German to American soldiers at the university, and also taught them German culture. For example, how to eat. You know, we eat differently. In America, we keep transferring forks and knives. You folks don't do that. So that when the American soldiers came over here, they could speak properly, and they could have German mannerisms in case they became spies. And she continued to do that work and all through the war. And after I was born, which was in 45, she no longer worked professionally again, ever. Well, it's interesting. Clearly my parents were feeling a lot of anti-Semitism because in 1935, my father and his mother took a boat and went to the United States to see if it was a place they wanted to live. My mother didn't go because she was pregnant at the time with my sister, and that trip would have been too hard for her. And they went really with the intention to see if the United States was a place they would like to live. And in those days, the United States consisted of landing in New York and looking at New York. And he didn't like New York. And came back here and said to my mother, and I heard this story many times, we're not moving. We are well accepted in the Fürth community. We have always been well accepted in the Fürth community. Nothing will happen to us. We have enough friends, both in the Jewish and non-Jewish world. And we're not leaving. And so they didn't. And they stayed. My sister was born here. And by 1937, my parents did want to emigrate and began making plans to emigrate, and then my father was arrested. And he was tried and convicted of a felony for what I believe in English is called moral turpitude. I don't know what that is in German, but essentially, through the Nuremberg laws, Jews could put their money in the banks or in German bonds, or they had to declare their money. Since my father owned his own business, if he kept any other money, that was illegal. No, even in Deutsche Mark, if he kept it at home or with the intention of sending it to the United States, he could not do that. And he had to always sign, apparently when he went to a bank or something, this is all the money he had, and he always signed that. He was actually arrested because he signed statements that that was all the money he had when he actually had more money than that. And he was put in prison then. In 1937, the end of 1937, he was put into prison. He went to court, and he was convicted of a felony. So it was a crime according to German law, and he was in prison. He was not in a concentration camp, and he remained in prison then until March of 1939, when he was released because his sentence was up. I actually think that his being in prison saved his life during Kristallnacht, because on Kristallnacht, my mother and sister, the house had already been taken away, their house. They had moved into my mother's uncle's house here in Fürth also. My mother's uncle and aunt had already moved to Paris, so they just moved in, and all the clothes were still there, and the Nazis came and stayed with them for 72 hours, waiting for the men to come home. And then my father, it was very complicated. They then lost their visas to enter the United States because Daddy had a felony, and they also lost their passports to leave from Germany. So there was an enormous amount of effort on my mother's part during that time my father was in prison to reinstate their visas and to get passports. And my father actually left Germany the day he got out. He didn't know what was going on, but a friend met him at prison, gave him his passport. My mother didn't have a passport yet. My sister was on my father's passport, and they left and went to Paris. And Mother joined them a few weeks later. They absolutely closed their eyes. They didn't believe it. I think that I've done quite a bit of reading on the history of that time, and I've asked some of my parents' friends who are still alive, who lived through it, what they thought when Hitler said certain things, and they said they didn't take him seriously, that they didn't think he would become that powerful. It was so off. It was so out of, and I feel the same way a little bit when I walk around Germany. It seems impossible that something like this could be happening when, sort of normal people on normal streets with children being real. I mean, it doesn't make sense. Hindsight is 20/20, and I think about it in the United States, which is where I live, also in a world where I live as a Jew among many non-Jews. And it's hard for me to imagine if suddenly something very anti-Semitic would happen, that people who knew me all my life and my family and who were part of a community would in any way turn on me. It doesn't make sense. All I know is that my father was in prison, and they never went to the prisons to get Jewish men out of the prisons, at least not where Daddy was. And my mother and sister were alone in this house, and the Gestapo did come, but they waited for the men, and there were no men. I don't know if my mother was hurt that night. I don't know. She would not talk about it. I know she was terrified. My sister was a baby. Kristallnacht, my sister was 2.5 years old. Oh yeah, it was a terrifying time, and my mother was terrified. My father knew nothing about it. I know how little my father knew about it because I have the correspondence between my parents when my father was in prison. and I've read all of it. And he got the letters changed. They couldn't write much, everything was censored, but the letters changed after Kristallnacht. And you could tell that there was some unrest, but he had no idea really what was going on. So he didn't really know what was happening. She did. I have no sense about anybody trying to help her get out. I also don't have any sense that she would have left my father. In fact, that was an issue. She wouldn't leave, and my grandmother wouldn't leave until she could bring this. She wouldn't have left him in prison. My mother, it's a long story. My father's brother, his name was Mox, Ron, had gone to America in the 1920s with a friend of his because they were the younger sons and they were not going to take over their businesses. And they wanted to have an adventure. I don't think they went there to emigrate. They went there to be there for a few years. And then the Nuremberg guys came, and they stayed. When my father was arrested, my uncle, who at that time lived in San Juan, Puerto Rico, went up to Washington, left his job, took a leave of absence, and went to Washington, D.C. to see if he could work with my mother's from Germany in getting my father's visa reinstated, because the United States had a law at that time that they would not accept for permanent immigration anyone who had a felony. And my father had a felony. And so there's an enormous amount of correspondence between my mother and my uncle and the Attorney General of the United States, who at that time was Homer Cummings. And in fact, the last statement by Homer Cummings as he left office in December of 1938 was about the Jew A.R., which is my father, Alfred Ron. And the articles from the New York Times and the Washington Post that, in fact, it was not a felony. That crime was not a felony. And it's the first time in the history of the United States that it looked into the internal laws of another country to decide whether or not that was in fact a felony and if a person should be allowed to have a visa. So his visa was reinstated from the United States after that year's work, but they didn't have passports. When I was here a year ago and went through all the archives in Nuremberg, because I wanted to look at my father's criminal records, I learned that the Germans, the Nazis, were kept going over and over to make sure all the people's bills were paid and all the papers were in order and the businesses were in the houses and everything were turned over before they would allow people to leave. And they kept delaying issuing passports for my parents and for my sister. In fact, there was a request at some point that they give a passport just to my sister. It became clear from what I'd read that my parents made an effort to get my sister out of Germany, and the Germans wouldn't issue it. And ultimately, they issued a passport for my father and my sister, which meant my sister couldn't get out until my father got out of prison. And my parents had a friend who helped a lot of Jews get out of Germany, and he made sure that when the prison term was over, that my father was released, and then immediately took him to the train station with my sister. So that's how they got out. My mother's passport, she had to stay here then and sign over the rest of whatever had to be signed over, and she left a few weeks later. My father wouldn't have known it. My father knew nothing. Mother probably knew it, and that probably accounts for a lot of nightmares she had for many years in the States. But they didn't talk about it. I'm telling you, they did not. It was verboten. The two closest family members of ours that were victims was my father's brother, who did not get out, James Ron was his name, and my grandmother, my maternal grandmother's mother, who actually by that time had a stroke. She was very ill and we couldn't get her out. And that's what I'm told. My grandmother went to Theresienstadt. My great-grandmother, my uncle, I didn't really know what happened to him. Gisela Blume told me that I knew he had been in an institution. He was somewhat retarded, and apparently they took them all out and just shot them in the square. In the 50s, my grandmother didn't know anything about her mother's death and was interested in finding out if there was any way to find out what had happened to her mother. And so she wrote to Germany and asked if they had any information, and never heard anything back. And in the meantime, I grew up and my parents died, and about 19 years later, no joke, my grandmother, who by that time was very elderly, got a letter back from some official in Germany, Frau Bechmann, and it was as if they were answering a letter that she'd written last week. They said, in response to your letter written, this is in German, on July 1957 or whatever, we just wanted to let you know that your mother, Caroline Metzger, was taken to Theresienstadt, wurden, and she only lived there for 4 or 5 days before she died. And so they told us exactly when she was deported there. I haven't the dates. So that's all I know. Till I came here, I didn't know what they lived like here. We lived a very simple life. We had a very small house, especially after I see what they lived in here. It had to be a big adjustment for them. My parents had a rather unusual story in the United States. They arrived in New York like all other immigrants with every intention, I think, of staying in New York. The only family they knew was in New York. My father was extremely unhappy in New York. My parents loved the mountains. They spent a lot of time in Bavaria. And he decided with his little 3-year-old daughter that New York was not where they were staying. When I look back on it, I think what they did was probably very courageous. I was born in Denver, Colorado, and raised in Denver. Denver is about 2/3 of the way across the United States west, and it's at the foot of the Rocky Mountains. They chose it without knowing a human being there, without having a job. They chose it because there were mountains. And, they met a few Landsmen there as well, German Jews who had emigrated to Colorado for the same reasons, usually because they wanted to be in the mountains. But it was an interesting decision. During the war, my father first he worked in a lumber yard, then he worked for a luggage company, and eventually he got back into the steel business and was a sales representative for Eastern Steel Mills. My mother spoke English fairly well because she was very well educated and had learned a lot of it at school. Neither of them ever lived in an English-speaking country where they'd studied. But my father went to a much more traditional school and never went beyond gymnasium. He'd been apprenticed in the business and took over the business. And his English, I think, was a lot more broken than mother's, but they both had some English skills, yes. Mother's was probably fairly good. My mother was 28 years old, and my father was 38. No, I always think of my mother at least in her 40s also, but she was a young woman when she went through all this. Yeah, not at all. My mother anticipated a lot more than my father did. In fact, in 1934, with a fear that there was going to be much more destruction than had happened yet, my mother went around and she photographed, for example, all of the Jewish graves of all of our family in the cemetery, and she wrote a family history then of all of the family who was in Fürth and going back to the 1600s. So I have all of that. And I think she really anticipated that this would not be around very long, and did a lot of work on it. And again, I thought of her, as you just slipped also, as an older person doing it. And then I realized in 1934 she was 23 years old. I mean, so I put it all in perspective. No, I didn't know that these histories existed till they died. When they died and I went through their stuff, I found them. I never saw them before. I never saw it during my shared lifetime with them. And then I had a friend of mine work on it with me to translate it into words. So I've been working on it since then. Yeah. You know, being a child of parents who went through this dramatically impacts your life. And I can only tell you that in my family, I grew up knowing that the Holocaust was the most impactful thing that happened, even though I was born after it. And even though my parents aren't, by definition, survivors, they went to concentration camps. But to give an example of the kind of way in which it impacted on me and my life, when I was a child and I would get upset about something, I wasn't invited to a party, things that kids get upset about. The response always was, how can you be upset about that when 6 million Jews died? And, compared to 6 million Jews dying, obviously I couldn't get upset about it. So I always felt I wasn't entitled to have any feelings because I couldn't compare it to what happened to them. And I think that kind of stuff came over and over and over again. So they didn't talk about it directly in terms of what their experience was, but it was there all the time. No, actually, she coped worse than I did. She cut it off much more, she, in many ways, didn't want to know anything about it for a very long time, and had no, for her, anything about her background. She didn't even want people to know she was from Germany. She would say she was born in New York, and I was actually very proud that my parents were from Germany. I was a first-born American and all of that. She was very embarrassed that they had accents. I have children. Yes, I think very much more. We talk about it a lot, and we're very aware of it. In fact, my son was just in Europe for a month, about a month ago, and only cut across Germany briefly, and came back. He's 22 years old, and said, I was really surprised. Came back and said he was uncomfortable, and so we talked about it. I said, the Germans today aren't the Germans of yesterday, and I don't want to perpetuate hate. I really don't. But yeah, they know a lot about it. I actually was much more open in talking to them about all of this than my parents were ever with me. And they wanted to know about it, I think, in a different sort of way. But I think it's easier in general to talk about that than it was 25 or 30 years ago. It seems like a long time, but it's only been in the last 10 years or so that books about it, that movies about it, that people are talking, that people have a sense that they don't want to forget. Up until then, it was as if you asked my parents about their childhoods here or their lives in Germany, their response to me would be, that was another time, we're in America now, we will always be grateful to the Americans for opening the door for us. And it was another life. It was like it didn't exist. It's hard for me to imagine how you can cut it off that way, but they really do. I think that for me, it's easier to integrate it and to see it as a whole. They came back once in 1969. And they came back with American friends of theirs. They wanted to show them where they had been, where they lived. And my father, I think, had forgotten. What he said is he forgot how beautiful Germany was, and sort of re-experienced Germany's beauty. My mother could not see any of its beauty in the landscape or the people. She really, it was much too painful for her. She was much too angry still. My mother's life really was altered by the Holocaust. She became an ardent Zionist and a Zionist. A Zionist is somebody who wants a Jewish homeland, wants Israel to be a Jewish homeland, and wants to establish a state for Zion. Okay, for Jews, and she really, you say, did she use her PhD not professionally, not to earn money, but she became an absolute expert on the state of Israel, and was fervently involved in education and working on establishing and creating a mechanism to maintain the Jewish state. Oh, many times. She led tours there. She would have emigrated there. Why didn't she do it? She wouldn't leave us, her children. But when we got older, she often talked about how she wished she could go to Israel to live. And because my father, I think, wasn't interested in going there. Well, I think that that's a tough question. I think, number one, we have to tell the truth about what the history was. I think people need to know it should never be repeated to anybody. This is, one should not forget. I think that there must be children, my age, children of parents in Germany who suffer as much as I did from what that war was like. I think that children of SS officers, children of people who were very involved, have to have lived in families of silence, but it has to be easier to be a family of silence of the victims than the perpetrators. And I think that there must be a way that we get together and sort of end the hate. But I don't know more than just telling history as it is so people know. I think also what you're doing right now is important. We can't wipe out the fact that there was, in a town like Fürth and all over Germany, a very substantial Jewish community that contributed substantially to the secular community as well. And to pretend it didn't exist and it didn't have an impact, I think is a mistake for the younger generations. I think about that a lot. I don't think I would have been born because I don't think my parents would have waited that long to have a second child. But I can talk about what my sister's life would have been like. Well, it would have been very different. My parents lived a very, very privileged life here in terms of finances. And we lived a very middle class at best life in the United States. So in that sense, it would have been very, very different. I think that, growing up in Denver, Colorado, and where you never leave the country, you speak one language, you don't have all of the Gemütlichkeit that you can have from going from one country to the other here is very different. So I think financially we would have been very different. I think that if Hitler had not existed, our sense of Israel and a Jewish state would not have existed, which had an enormous impact on my growing up, because I don't think my parents would have been involved in that. I think that was an interest or a concern of theirs here. They mostly were involved in their business, and they did a lot of skiing and a lot of hiking and a lot of theater and art and that kind of stuff. I think my mother would have been much more involved professionally in something, which would have probably been very different. I think it would have been dramatically different. And I thought about that coming here, actually. I was saying to my husband on the way, I'm going to meet people here who either knew my parents or, if they're my generation, would have been my friends, my peers. And we're with them all over the world now. So it threw us into a whole different world and culture. Yes, there is. I can answer that question for you. There's something called the Fürth group, or Fürth Society, and they meet every 4 years, and they just met this past year in New York, and people apparently from all over the world, they're Jews, from all over the world come, and they get together, and now the next generations are going. I've never gone. It is something my parents would not have considered doing. I'm telling you, they knew about some of these things early on. They would not have wanted to get that together to remember, because they would not have wanted to remember. I think it was too hard. They would have thought it was, ridiculous is too strong, but we should let go of that. We shouldn't think about it. We've got to move on. Yeah, I'll do it someday. I would have done it last year. I knew about it last year. It happened to be up during the time I couldn't go. But I'll do it sometime. I have a lot of stuff with me. When my parents died, I found a trunk full of documents in the basement, and I have a lot of these kinds of things I need to put together. Actually, Frau Blume came to Boston last year, and we went through them together. She helped me identify what they are. So there's either copies or some other things.